Good evening. My name is John Seidel. I'm director of Washington College's Center for Environment and Society and also on the faculty in Anthropology and Environmental Studies. And I want to welcome you to Recipes for Change. As you can see from the slide up here, and I think most of you know, this is a four-part lecture series, and it focuses on what we eat, how we eat, and what we think about our food and how we can change that for the better. And when we kicked off this series, my colleague Bill Schindler said something about this, and he explained really that the way we've set this up, our first two speakers have the important role of contextualizing our food and the way we think about it. And the second two speakers really talk about how real-world solutions can perhaps change some of the things that we eat and how we think about it, essentially the current problems that we face. Tonight's lecture is the second in the series, and it not only contextualizes our foodways, but it provides a bridge to the present. So it takes us through the recent past up to where we are right now. We think that taken as a whole, our hope is that this series is going to offer some hope for the future and inspire all of us to make changes that we think are probably necessary in improving our health and the health of the planet. Before we get to the big issues, though, a few thank yous. Although I'm doing the welcome this evening, I have some very important partners in this. Bill Schindler conceptualized this, I think, especially in cahoots with Ted Maris-Wolf. Bill is a professor of anthropology here at Washington College, and Ted is the deputy director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. This is a collaboration between the Center for Environment and Society, the C.V. Starr Center, and anthropology. And as all collaborations go, we got a lot of people who have played a role in making this happen. On the staff side, Kathy Thornton from the Center for Environment and Society has been instrumental in doing this, along with Michael Buckley and Jean Wortman of C.V. Starr. College relations team has put together these great posters and tried to get the word out, which is why we have such a great packed house. Shane Brill, Wendy Clark, Marshall Lanskroner, James Arnold have all been important in that. Dean Emily Chamley Wright and Brian Wright have been really supportive of this effort. Robin Gillespie, who is head of catering here at Washington College, as you'll see later on, has played an important role in this. Teresa Mychek from Colchester Farms, Tara Holste and Andy Goddard, who are kind of our doyens really of healthy food in Chestertown. And then also Shannon Weibel, who has set up a great display of books back here, so we'll have books that you can buy from our author. And a huge thank you to Bill Schindler's first-year class, his GRW class, which is studying foods and has prepared some interesting things for you after the reception. Those of you who were here last time will know that you'll find some interesting and very wonderful things on the other side of that door once this lecture is over. And afterward, we also have a farm share over here at this table, the round table in the corner. If you come to each of these four lectures, at each lecture you can sign one of these raffle cards, put it in the bowl, and at the end we will pick a winner, which will get a share from Colchester Farms, from the community-supported agriculture there. So I encourage you to do that. Now, I should also mention that this lecture is being taped, so if anybody objects to being on video, hide in the back of the room or something, but you're forewarned. So now to this evening's subject. This series has a trajectory, and it's been very well thought out. 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Brianna Pabiner here from the Smithsonian to talk about paleo diets. She talked about the relationship really between human evolution and how and what we eat. And she covered huge time spans. I mean, she went back several million years, and she talked really about how our biological past has influenced what we eat. She also talked about how humans started to hunt big game animals and how they started targeting them and using tools and things like deferring consumption, which most animals don't do. These are cultural things, right? They are not genetic, they are not ingrained in us. But the fact is, when we go back that far in time, really the causal direction is kind of from environment to us. It's environment really that shaped our ancestors and constrained them in many ways. When we get up to the present, as we're going to talk about tonight, the causal direction is in a different orientation. We have a huge impact on the environment, our technology in particular. This is one of the things that we come to grips with all the time, and many of our students see. And the way people think about their food can be very, very different from place to place, and it can change very rapidly. We take a group of students each year to Peru, and one of the things that has really startled us there, I think, is that you see strange foods there like guinea pig and the like, but also this little fish called the anchoveta. We know it as anchovies, and maybe you get them on pizza, or maybe you tell them not to put them on your pizza. It's a very different fish down there, though, and it is a huge, huge part of the ecosystem. In this cold, upwelling water there are millions of these fish. They are the underpinning, really, of this environment, and people have eaten them for millennia. And in fact, there is one of the earliest cities, the earliest city in the Americas, Caral, is on the Peruvian coast there. It rivals in time period ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it's built not on agriculture, but on fish, right? So people have been eating this fish for 6,000 years or better, and after World War II, there was this huge change. All of a sudden, industrial fishing came in. They started making it a large fishery. It's now the largest single species fishery in the world. And it was a seismic shift in the way it was used. No longer is it eaten by people. It's ground in a meal, and it's fed to salmon and to chickens and used as a base for cosmetics. And how could this happen where you've got this incredible source of protein in a country that has malnourishment, and this fish really isn't eaten for human consumption? It's a change in the way people think. We look at it from the outside and we say, how can this be? What we don't realize very often is that the same thing is happening right here. That fish was hijacked by changes in technology, changes in marketing. The same thing is happening with our food. We've been hijacked by new developments in agriculture and production, in marketing and distribution networks, economic systems. We've changed the way we think about food, and not for the better. And we've also forgotten a lot about food. Our speaker tonight has given this a lot of thought. Ann Vileisis is an environmental historian and author. She got her BA in history from Yale with a focus in environmental studies, and then she went on to get a master's degree in history from Utah State University, focusing on social and environmental history of the Western railroads in desert areas. And in 1999, the pendulum kind of swung, I guess, to wetlands, and she published this amazing book, Discovering the Unknown Landscape, A History of America's Wetlands. I mean, it really is a terrific read. Received the Herbert Feist Award from the American Historical Association and the George Perkins Marsh Prize from the American Society for Environmental History. She's been recognized by fellowships at the Smithsonian and at the Ford Family Foundation. And her most recent book is Kitchen Literacy, How We Lost Knowledge of Where Food Comes From and Why We Need to Get It Back. In it, she walks us through the history of food from the colonial kitchen to modern megamarts. It's been labeled one of the 50 books that will change your life. Library Journal talks about it as being an important and eye-opening book that uncovers the machinery behind the modern food industry. And she has shared this lost knowledge as a guest on Martha Stewart Living, West Coast Live, many other television and radio programs. And now we're very fortunate to have her here with us this evening. So please join me in welcoming Ann Vileisis.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for hosting me. I've been here all day, and I've had a great time. The hospitality of Chestertown and students has been wonderful. Washington College, I've had so many interesting discussions, so it's really been wonderful to be here and get to know some of you. So you were mentioning my first book, about the history of wetlands. I want to tell you one of the things I was telling some students tonight. It actually started as my senior project in college, that book. And so it just goes to show, since you have students tonight, that sometimes even though it can set you off on a really big, important path, that's what happened to me. And it was when I was finishing my book about the history of wetlands, that book taught me that one of the big things that had happened to wetlands is that more than half of them in America had been converted to farmlands. And it was that realization that really started me thinking more about the connections between our food system and the environment. And once I kind of started to hone in on that topic, of course, I started to realize, oh, there's a lot of news about this coming out. I started to, hear stories in the news about how aquifers were being depleted to irrigate crops, how herbicides were showing up in drinking water, that factory farms, animal agriculture were polluting rivers and estuaries, that pesticides were implicated in deformities of birds and wildlife, all sorts of kind of harrowing things. And yet, when I went to the supermarket to shop, it was like as if I entered an entirely different world. Food was plentiful and colorful, cheap and playful, in fact. I mean, there was Tony the Tiger and Count Chocula and Betty Crocker and, thousands of products, familiar as ever, that I'd seen my entire life. But somehow, suddenly, I started to realize that all the foods on all those shelves had real stories, and I knew absolutely none of them. And I was just struck by the utter absurdity of that modern cultural circumstance that we all find ourselves in. And I wondered, how on earth did we get into this situation where we know so little about what we eat, about what we put into our bodies and from the things that our bodies are made from, and just think it's totally normal? And I wanted to really know that for several reasons once I kind of had that question come to mind. I love to cook and eat. I'm one of these people who's always playing with food and making new things in the kitchen, and I'm a historian. So I thought it would be fascinating to understand how people have known food and how that changed through time. I thought that would be revealing. I also had strong memories from childhood. I was fortunate to have a grandmother who took me into the woods gathering mushrooms every fall, and I vividly remembered the brilliant colored leaves, that rich, earthy smell of the forest, bringing bushels of mushrooms back to her kitchen where we would wash, clean them carefully, and then saute them in butter. And I just wondered if there was more to my memories than just mere nostalgia. And finally, I had a strong sense that if we're to be better stewards of our land and water and of our own bodies and communities, that we needed to have a better understanding of the historical factors that have contributed to our modern, everyday habit of really looking the other way when it comes to understanding the sources of our foods. I mean, that's kind of what we do. We just don't really pay attention. And I think history is important in that regard, because the story that we tell ourselves about how we got to this place right now in time is really the crucial stepping off place for the path ahead. And so if we tell ourselves the story that cooking is too hard, or that food is just fuel, or that the system that we have now is the best it can be, and we close our eyes to the hidden costs, health and environmental, of cheap food, then we won't be open to and excited by the possibilities of creating something that might be even better, that might serve our needs better as a society. And I also think history is really important because it gives us a unique perspective that change is not only possible, but inevitable, that the food system has been changing all the time. And so I think that is an empowering perspective that helps us to realize, or helps us to think about how we might participate and how we might change our own lives and be part of these changes. So I think that's a really helpful and important perspective that history provides us. So what I'd like to do tonight is take you guys on an armchair tour through time and show you some of the things I learned when I was doing research on my book. And I know some students have been reading my book, so I'm going to be especially excited to show you guys some of the images that inform my research that you may have been able to read about in the book.
My project as a historian was to go back to the kitchens of pre-industrial America and then follow through time, keeping my bead on what cooks knew and didn't know about their foods as the distance between farms and kitchens grew. And to figure this out, I had to scour history books and journal articles and old cookbooks, almanacs and magazines. These are all the kinds of sources that historians don't usually use, but they can be very rich and really offer interesting information. But it wasn't until I found the diary of Martha Ballard, dating from the 1790s, that I really got a sense of what it was like to create and prepare a meal 200 years ago. In this era, few women had the time or inclination to write about their everyday lives, but Martha was really extraordinary. She kept a daily journal about her life as a midwife and also as a gardener and cook. And in the details of her diary, I found a very different way of thinking about food. For example, on August 15th, 1790, Martha wrote, had baked lamb with green peas and cucumber in her diary. But like so many of the meals that she wrote about, this one was a culmination of many stories that I was able to trace through time in her diary. The lamb came from a farm down the road in exchange for some work her son had done. The green peas came from a garden bed not far out the back of her kitchen door, where I could see the date she planted them and the date she had harvested them. Butter was churned with milk from a cow that Martha or her children milked and tended every day. Of the 70 or so different foods that Martha mentioned in her diary, the great majority came from places very nearby. Only a few ingredients, like cinnamon and saffron, came from afar, and they were used only in small amounts. If you can see from this list, there's one orange. So that's years and years of her diary. There was one orange she received as a Christmas gift one year. It's just sort of shocking to just think about that nowadays. Of course, we eat oranges all the time. But at that time, eating mostly from local food sheds was really quite common because most people lived in rural areas, about 95% of households in America. And also, the cost of transportation of foods was really quite high. So that was important that was part of the economics of the way things worked at that point. So several things became evident when I was reading through Martha's diary. Certainly cooking food required a tremendous amount of exhausting work. But even more remarkable to me was just how much Martha had to know in order to orchestrate her family's eating. To eat cabbage greens in the early spring, which was very important after a long winter in Maine. It's probably like a long winter in Maryland this year. She had to plant the seeds of cabbage the spring before, nurture them all the way through the summer, dig them up in the fall, put them in a root cellar through the winter, kind of make sure they didn't freeze, plant them out again in early spring after the danger of frost had passed, and then grow them. She was able to harvest some of the greens early on at that point, but then she had to grow them out all the second year to grow them to seeds so she could start the cycle again. So that's just, one food. To eat sausage in April required her to fatten the animals the summer before into the fall, and then, of course, wait until it was cool enough to butcher and preserve the meat in the fall. To eat a pumpkin pie in March, she had to tend the pumpkin patch through the summer and then harvest the pumpkins and dry them. And so every kind of food had this whole body of knowledge that she had to integrate and prepare. So preparing a meal was not a task squeezed in at the end of a busy day, but really it was an all-encompassing aspect of Martha and her family members' life. And interwoven with that firsthand knowledge was a frank awareness that food came from the land, from animals, and from people's work and effort. But this type of traditional knowledge, food knowledge, would begin to change dramatically as America's cities grew through the 19th century and as our food system began to expand and industrialize. So consider, for just one thing, the traditional expectation of knowing about the lives of animals that became meat. So in Martha's days, animals showed up in the ink of her diary. There were simple entries I followed, like 6 chicks hatched today, and then later in the year killed a chicken and made soup. And they kind of captured a seamless movement from life to death to life that was a real routine part of her everyday life and experience. As cities began to grow and early cookbooks advised women how to choose meat at markets, urban homemakers could still expect to know lots about the animals that were becoming their meats. For example, cookbooks advised women to know very specifically about the age, sex, and even the work habits of animals. And here you'll see that, I don't know if you can read it, that mutton is best when it's grass-fed, between 2 and 3 years old, and is female. So those are the kinds of things people are thinking about. Then homemakers were advised to find a butcher who knew these kinds of things. But as the meat business changed dramatically in the second half of the 19th century, with the expansion of railroads, this changed quite a lot. More and more beef traveled to eastern markets from the open-range grasslands of the Great Plains. Cattle were loaded onto railheads, or driven to railheads and loaded onto trains in Kansas, Then they made a 5-day trip to market. They often became dehydrated and sick on the journey as they were kind of slammed together on the railroad tracks. And butchers knew that there was a problem because they could see in the meat kind of became livid and yellow. So to address those problems and sensing a great opportunity, the grand 19th century entrepreneur, the meatpacker Gustavus Swift, decided to apply the emerging principles of industrialization to producing meat. He realized that hauling the live animals all the way from the Great Plains to market was really inefficient because about only 55 pounds of the animal were usable as meat. And so he instead envisioned a way to mass butcher the animals in Chicago, use the byproducts for different products, and then to transport only the dressed meat to Eastern markets. This required tremendous innovation and investment, if you can think about it. I mean, massive holding pens and feedlots, plus farms and feed to keep the cattle fat and ready year-round for disassembly lines. Then specially designed railroad cars that could keep the carcasses cool, plus ice ponds, ice houses, a whole force of ice workers to keep the meat trains cool through the summer months. And yet, even after Swift surmounted all of these technical obstacles in making this whole system work, I just can't believe how many things he had to kind of change to get it to work. He still had to overcome another impediment, which was customer revulsion. As his son would later remark, at that time, no Yankee had ever before eaten a steak from more than 25 miles away. And so getting people to buy this dressed beef all the way from Chicago really required changing people's fundamental thinking about meat. At first, Swift tried to piggyback onto the reputation of local butchers and sell his meats through existing shops, but they were mistrustful. The idea of selling meat that had been raised and butchered 1,000 miles away flew in the face of everything they knew about purveying meat. Some even put signs in their windows, "No Chicago beef sold here." But to overcome the skepticism, Swift set up his own shops. Then he undercut the competition by cutting his prices below the cost of production for a while. And with the low prices, city shoppers were finally tempted to try the cheap dressed beef fattened in Chicago with corn and feedlots. And when they did taste it, it did taste better than those haggard animals that had made the journey thousands of miles in railroad cars. By 1893, the noted cooking expert of the time, Maria Parloa, explained to readers in Good Housekeeping magazine that lingering prejudice against Chicago beef was no longer justified. She advised that city shoppers didn't really need to worry themselves anymore about animals, living animals as standing on their feet, but instead to study the diagrams of cuts as they are found in the markets. And so in a very, very short time, the traditional knowledge that it was important to know about the lives of the animals that became our meat became utterly obsolete. So while knowing about animals' lives had traditionally been considered important, so too was the idea of using our senses to evaluate foods. Advice about buying foods at markets often had recommended sniffing for odors, denting meat with your fingers, looking directly in the eyes of a fish to see if it was fresh. But new types of foods started to make this firsthand sensory approach more difficult. Nowadays, of course, canned foods are so familiar and common that they really exemplify commonness. But back in the late 19th century, when they were a new technology, they were considered highly suspect. And for perspective, just consider before cans, foods were leafy and green and fleshy and earthy. Some still had dirt attached to them. But cans with their shiny armor hid their contents and really made it difficult for a home cook to know what she was getting. And indeed, in those early days of canning, The technology was new and it wasn't really entirely worked out before cans came onto the market, and so unsavory problems were in fact quite frequent. One woman actually found the whole head of a rooster in a can, while others encountered spoilage, adulteration, and the tastes of heavy metals, because at the time, metals like zinc and lead were used as a soldering to seal up the cans. Yet still, to demystify the new technology, the early food manufacturers started to use labels to supply the kinds of information that people were accustomed to, which is where and how their foods were produced. So this is an early label, probably from like the decade after the Civil War, which is when cans kind of started to become a little bit more prevalent. And this label explains in tremendous loquacious detail that this farm, that the canning factory is located right in the middle of the cornfield, because of course at that time the corn was less sweet than it is now, and so it was very important to get the corn into the cans right away. So it goes into explaining all that. And there's also a thing, I don't know if you can read here, it says, warranted to retain all its original flavor for years in any climate. And so of course this is the label explaining the new concept of shelf life, because at that time people were unfamiliar with the fact that a processed food could last long. So that's kind of interesting. Here's another label, probably from about 20 or 25 years later, after more sophisticated printing comes in, from corn grown in Camden, Brooklyn, back when Brooklyn still had a brook. And as you can see, this image really situates the product right in the context where it's grown. There's even this gangly frog that helps to make the product appealing and seem that it's kind of more authentic, even though it's a product of modern industry. And here's a beautiful label from a can of lobsters in which a specific place, Egmont Bay, is part of the can's appeal, assuring buyers that the lobster came from clean waters at a time when water pollution from cities and industry is becoming more problematic. But if cans and other manufactured foods had pretty labels on the outside that did not guarantee the quality of what was on the inside, at the time, food adulteration was a huge problem. One federal study in 1890 found that about 15% of America's food products were not what they said they were. And so that's, 1 in 6 items, going shopping 1 in 6 times and getting something you don't think you're getting. And so these are things like having flour in your, or having sawdust in your flour, or hay seeds in your strawberry jam, stuff like that. And so for reasons of tradition, health, and economy, many homemakers remained really skeptical of these manufactured food products. Even women's magazines advised buying food in as unmanufactured state as possible. So all these changes in food set upon a larger backdrop of continuing urbanization. America's population grew sharply in the second half of the 19th century. And as cities became ever more crowded, smoky, and filthy, because of course this time cities don't have a lot of the infrastructure that we expect to have today, like sewers and things like that, middle and upper class city dwellers started to look to nature as a refuge and to suburbs. In this context, city dwellers were coming to have an entirely new kind of relationship with the natural world and also with their foods. And I think this is a vintage postcard from that time that I think captures this ironic transition pretty well. Of course, this woman is no longer milking the cow. She's enjoying it as a pastoral character, and she's drinking her milk from cans. It's an interesting transition. But many people were really anxious about this big change. Some urban reformers, this is during the progressive era, started to recognize that children coming of age at this time would be the largest generation ever to grow up completely disconnected from the natural world. And so to address this concern, progressive reformers started nature study in school gardens to teach kids about the origins of their foods. At the turn of the 20th century, 26,000 kids in New York State participated in such programs. And I think some of these photos are just really poignant because, of course, at that time, too, people couldn't travel as much as we do now. So you couldn't leave the city and go and see trees. And so if you're If you grew up in a neighborhood like this that was so industrial with smokestacks in the back, this is kind of the scene that you would have. So I think that concern is particularly poignant. One high school teacher explained that growing vegetables was a revelation and intense joy to city-bred children whose nature instinct had been starved. Concern about nature applied to the new manufactured foods, too. One of the ways that food seemed less natural had to do with the artificial colors and preservatives that were increasingly added by manufacturers to these food products. And when they first came on the scene, it was unclear how they should be regarded. If they were adulterants that deceived shoppers into buying poor quality foods, or if they were useful ingredients that had legitimate value. And a key person at the center of grappling with that question was this guy, Dr. Harvey Wiley, who became the chief of the USDA's Bureau of Chemistry, which was the predecessor of the modern-day FDA, Food and Drug Administration. And Wiley had grown up on a farm, and so he still held traditional values and expectations about food, and he really did not like the way foods were changing. He became particularly concerned about preservatives. And in his most celebrated study at the outset of the 20th century, he convened a group of healthy young college men to participate in an experiment that would not be allowed today. I'm sure it would not be allowed on this campus. For a year, these young men ate meals with gradually increasing amounts of preservative added. And some of these preservatives were things like formaldehyde, which I personally remember from grade school biology class. That's what they put the frogs in that you were dissecting. Really awful stuff. And sure enough, it's no surprise these guys started to experience uncomfortable side effects. Their esophagi started to burn, and they had throat problems and stomach problems. And the press dubbed this group the Poison Squad, and it was a media sensation at the time. And the experiment convinced Dr. Wiley of the need for government oversight in the food manufacturing realm. And the Poison Squad did much to boost public interest in the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which was America's first federal food legislation. It outlawed the most harmful additives, it required manufacturers to list ingredients, and it set hygienic standards for the first time. So it did some really important things to solve problems in the food system. Ironically, from our perspective today, it also, the legacy of that is that a lot of smaller farms and food producers cannot meet the standards of these very large, that are set for very large corporations or large manufacturing plants and facilities. So it's an interesting irony. But most important for our story tonight is at this time when people were very anxious about factory-made food products and what was in them, the passage of the Federal Pure Food and Drug Act really gave consumers a new sort of assurance that government was watching and kind of helping to make sure foods were safe. And that, I think, made it easier for shoppers to relinquish the traditional expectation of knowing what was in their foods. Around the same time, a new profession was gaining steam and began to exert tremendous influence on how we think about foods, and that was home economics. The idea was to boost the quality of women's lives by bringing a scientific approach to household work. So you see in this picture, they're seeing how long it takes for her to stir whatever she's stirring. And so new home ec departments started at land-grant universities and developed curricula for schoolgirls, and they really did much to spread important new understanding of germs and nutrition. At first, home economists pressed young women to become educated in the science of cookery. You can notice that the microscope in the picture, with the idea being that, you can look in through a microscope and see if something's in there that's not supposed to be in there. But more and more, their orientation would migrate toward promoting manufactured food products. As the quality of those manufactured foods improved, as attachments to tradition weakened, as more people moved to cities, and as feminist convictions strengthened, home economists began to see things very differently. They came to regard manufactured foods as the vanguard of society's advancement. And so, though earlier household experts had been skeptical and taught that homemakers needed to know genuine foods just as they came from the farm, with the rise of home economics, the very idea of what constituted kitchen literacy was really turned on end. At this point, there's really just one thing to do, which is open a can. Another key factor that came in and influenced this transformation, how we were thinking about foods and food know-how, is advertising, of course. And the very earliest food promotions had tried to allay city dwellers' anxieties by assuring shoppers with familiar images and expected information, where foods were, what they, these are early trade cards. So here you have the clam, telling you that the clam chowder is really good, kind of funny. And these early trade cards are some of the very earliest forms of advertising. But as America's food system industrialized, knowing where food came from and how it was actually made was actually becoming less appetizing. And so the advertising industry, which was brand new at the time, really cut its teeth helping to ease Americans into new ways of knowing and thinking about their foods. I hope I'm not going to spill the beans too much, but one of the things that you will get to experience in the other room through these doors tonight is lard. And this is a really early lard ad that is, drawing on this beautiful corn-fed hog. But of course, at the time, this lard is made in those massive factories where they're slaughtering huge numbers of animals. And so it just goes to show some of how advertising started to work. Also, around the turn of the 20th century, people became aware of germs for the very first time and the ways that foods could actually be vectors for disease. And so in this context, advertising helped to set new criteria for what was important in picking foods. For example, in this ad, you see what would become a much more common pitch, not touched by hand. So that's different from nowadays. You kind of want something to be homemade, but then you don't really want somebody else to be touching your food. So in response to the anxiety that people felt about food made in factories, some manufacturers used food ads to convey pleasing associations with nature and farms. This ad shows the actual farm and wheat that was used to make shredded wheat. But increasingly, shredded wheat ads emphasized a different kind of nature. According to promotions, shredded wheat was made in a factory that was often called a conservatory, perched right at the edge of that great icon of natural beauty, Niagara Falls. The building had 400 glass windows that let in glorious sanitizing light, and even more, the ovens that powered, the biscuit ovens that baked shredded wheat were powered, in fact, by the hydropower, by the water going over those falls, and was supposed to impart all that potency right into the biscuits. But by the 1920s, some of these foods still weren't selling well enough, and it became clear to advertising experts that simply assuring homemakers that factory-made products were safe, natural, and pure was not enough. Advertisers had to promote the qualities of manufactured foods as somehow better than traditional homemade foods that they sought to replace. And one of the things they did to do this was to start to try to attach the growing prestige of modern science and technology to their products. So this is a classic ad from that era. The copy here explains that these university-trained scientists with their white lab coats and test tubes and glass flasks have spent 4 years and $100,000 to perfect a new formula, not a recipe, for nothing less than baked beans. Now, of course, baked beans have been made traditionally by mothers all the time, but the subtext of this ad is clear that now whatever is modern is better. And so prevalent ads like this one helped to impart new criteria about what was important in foods, the idea that modern was best. And then in a short time, ads started to take a new tack and began to fundamentally redirect homemakers' attentions away from the places and particulars of how foods were produced and to the personal and emotional context of how foods were consumed. Increasingly, ads sold the sentiment that a consumer might feel when using a product, or fear of how they might feel if they don't use a product. For example, in this ad on Wonder Bread plays on a woman's anxieties about what might happen if she doesn't serve Wonder Bread, that her husband might leave her, and that if he does, people are going to whisper about it. Through the 1920s, then, those ads that had been formerly cited in fields and factories moved decisively indoors to breakfast nooks and dining rooms. And by the 1930s, ads that had suggested that it had become downright glamorous to use modern products like canned cream of mushroom soup, or at least that's what the manufacturers were trying to convince homemakers. And through the 1920s and 30s, chain stores and then supermarkets became the perfect outlets for manufactured foods. But supermarkets presented an unexpected new challenge for city shoppers. With the dizzying array of hundreds of food items, there were simply too many products for a consumer to actually know about the foods on all the shelves. This modern problem was first written about by Christine Frederick, who is best remembered for her 1929 book, Selling Mrs. Consumer, in which she promised to divulge to manufacturers the secrets of what American women truly desired. And in Frederick's opinion, one of those secrets was that American women did not want to be bothered with the work of knowing their foods anymore. To address this situation, she applied the industrial ideal of specialization to everyday life and recommended a friendly agreement between homemakers and food manufacturers that women would specialize in buying food products using brand names as their cue and leave all the unseemly details of food production to the food manufacturers. And this sort of agreement is more or less what actually happened. And as supermarkets became more and more popular, a new kitchen literacy really meant proficiency in picking modern products by brand names and price cues. So this transformation that I've described in how we know food started in cities, but then would fan out all across America through the 20th century. But it turns out that just as consumers were getting out of the habit of knowing where their foods came from and how they were made, big changes were afoot, big things were happening in American agriculture. It was precisely the time when consumers may have been, it would have been a good idea for people to pay more heed. In 1919, several boxes of pears showed up in a Boston market heavily speckled with a mysterious white powder. When public health officials checked, they found that the pears were covered with lead arsenate, which was a pesticide that had come into widespread use entirely unbeknownst to consumers. With the larger scale production to meet growing urban appetites, farmers had turned to things like lead arsenate and also to a number of dyes that were also used as pesticides to cope with increasing pest problems associated with growing crops in large monoculture fields and orchards. The pears in Boston were confiscated, but nothing was done to warn the public or to change the way pesticides were used. They didn't say, well, why don't you peel your fruit or wash your fruit or anything like that. Lead arsenate use continued to grow until World War II, when a new generation of pesticides came onto the scene. DDT had been used during wartime as a way to prevent soldiers from contracting insect-borne diseases, and it was heralded in the press during the war as a hero that had killed deadly bugs and was entirely safe for humans. And then after the war, stockpiles of the substance went straight into civilian use. Farmers used it to kill pests, food manufacturers used it to fumigate the insides of their cereal boxes and cracker boxes, and homemakers were encouraged to spray it in their homes as soldiers on a buggy home front. And although FDA researchers had serious reservations about this pesticide, its long-term health effects in food, they really had no authority to do anything about it. And so within a few years, the use of DDT and other similar pesticides skyrocketed, spreading a toxic mix of chemicals across the landscape. Very soon, it became evident that many pests develop resistance to DDT, which necessitated still greater use in an escalating arms race with insects, basically. Even more troubling, government researchers began to realize that DDT and its metabolites were showing up unexpectedly in people's fat and blood, in meats and milk. It would even show up in mother's breast milk. Yet, as DDT and other pesticides behaved in little understood ways, despite concern among public health experts, government agencies adopted a policy of quiet through the 1950s and early 60s, and they regarded the issue primarily as a matter of kind of a public relations problem. And so, with the widespread use of pesticides, the matter of knowing foods was ratcheted up to a new level of complexity. Not only were consumers unaware of pesticides' presence, but even experts charged with oversight were utterly bewildered. So the process of knowing food had gone from being something that an individual could do simply with senses and common sense to being a task that required a whole legion of experts, from entomologists to toxicologists and eventually even to risk analysts. So the rapid escalation of pesticide use is just one example of what happened in the time after consumers stopped paying attention and food production came to be governed entirely by the ideals of industrial efficiency. But through the 20th century, food production in all phases became increasingly dependent on cheap fossil fuels, from tractors and mechanical harvesters to canning plants and cross-country trucking. Even growing plants, which had been entirely solar-powered for all of history, became a petroleum-based enterprise. By the time of the 1970s energy crisis, researchers determined that foods had traveled on average 1,500 miles from farm to plate, and that for each calorie of food we ate, it took 10 calories to produce, 10 calories worth of petroleum to produce that. And today, a more recent estimate suggests that food comes from even farther away, and it now takes 400 gallons of oil to make the diet for one average American eater. So if you think about it, that's kind of like the equivalent of eating more than 1 gallon of petroleum per day. Just kind of shocking. So through the 1930s, the new fertilizers, innovations in plant breeding boosted crop yields enormously, but they also encouraged a trend towards soil consolidation, or soil erosion and farm consolidation, that drove many small farms out of business. Cheap, abundant corn, together with innovations in veterinary antibiotics, also made possible the further industrialization of animal agriculture, which produced meats more efficiently and cheaply than ever before, but also led to ethical dilemmas and hidden environmental costs. Enormous feedlots and factory farms become the biggest polluters of water in America. This is a modern picture of the upper Mississippi River, and what you see in the foreground is not a pasture, but a thick mat of algae that's growing on the water's surface, and overgrowth from the nutrients, the excess nutrients that are entering the system from dairy farmers upstream. And on the North Carolina's Neuse River, polluted runoff associated with massive hog farms has been implicated in some horrific water quality problems, from toxic algal blooms to enormous fish kills in the lower river. Meanwhile, in the post-World War II era, rapid suburbanization continued the trend of swallowing up farmland near cities, making the prospect of eating vegetables and fruits and meats that were grown close to home less and less possible. And I think this is the time when things like tomatoes that used to be in season that people used to be able to eat kind of went out of, we lost that possibility as more and more tomatoes came from either Florida or California only. So the 1960s brought a new and questioning spirit to America and to America's tables with several key counter-trends. In my book, I call them kitchen counter-trends. Thank you for laughing. Subtle joke. Some epicures who were increasingly interested in gourmet cooking, with the advent of Julia Child and such, had started to question the deteriorating taste and quality of America's foods, such as TV dinners and cake made from boxed mixes. A new generation of consumer advocates questioned the health effects of food additives, the use of which had also escalated after World War II to roughly 5 pounds per person by 1970. Environmentalists questioned the ecological effects of pesticides, which by the late 1960s were clearly implicated in the thinning of birds' eggs and the demise of pelicans and bald eagles. And concerns were raised about the living conditions of migrant farm workers, especially with the national grape boycott organized by Cesar Chavez. Nowadays, we know that farm workers' populations are the most exposed to pesticide drift and contaminated drinking water, and also often to very difficult labor and sometimes even coercive work situations. While in the 1950s, most urban and suburban Americans' knowledge or awareness about their foods may have been characterized by a naive, well, I don't know. By the 70s and 80s, with prevalent bad news about pesticides and repugnant animal factories, it had become a resigned, I don't want to know. And that's probably where we'd still be today if it weren't for a small group who took the enigmatic problem of the enormous, anonymous industrial food system to heart more personally and seriously. In the early 70s, a wave of idealistic back-to-land farmers headed out to the country to grow their own food. Many of them had to learn from old-time farmers who'd kind of never made the had never switched from traditional ways. Slowly but surely, some of these people began to build networks to supply pesticide-free foods to college towns and cities. There were food cooperatives that were a big part of this movement. And there in the bottom is the original Whole Foods Market in Austin, Texas in the 1970s. Eventually, some of these farm and food entrepreneurs, they became activists and entrepreneurs who advocated for an organic certification process that started originally kind of in states informally, but eventually became the federal organic law, or organic foods law in the early 90s. And gradually through the 90s, they helped to develop what would become today's booming national-scale organic foods industry. Demand for organic food products increased by 20% per year over much of the past decade, and even during the recession, it has continued to increase. And along with this growing demand, certified organic farmland and ranchland has grown to over 4 million acres. According to the 2007 agricultural census, which is the last agricultural census that we have, there were over 20,000 organic farms in the United States, and that has reduced pesticide use and pollution across large acreages. Consumers now have more access to buy organic foods than ever before, and their buying power continues to help push agriculture in these new directions of growing foods with less pollutants and paying greater attention to soil and land stewardship. Many have attributed the rise of organic foods to the continuing press of troubling news about what's in our foods. But I think that history reveals it's more than just that, because ever since the modern urban industrial food system started, Americans have had to struggle to find a satisfying way to eat and to know our foods in a complex, ever-changing, and often sometimes fictional labyrinth of food information. And so one of the key things the organic food movement has done is direct consumers' attention back to farms, giving us new possibilities for knowing the actual source and stories of our foods once again. This has contributed to a groundswell of interest in local foods and agriculture, because it turns out that knowing the real people and stories and places behind our foods, and not just brand names and calorie counts, is a very deeply satisfying and meaningful thing to many of us. Farmers markets and farm stands are some of the most visible and promising signs of this interest in local agriculture. In the mid-1980s, there were fewer than 100 farmers markets in America. Now there are well over 5,000. And where people don't have farmers markets, they're scrambling to figure out how to get them. One community I visited in New England, where I grew up in Connecticut, people really wanted a farmer's market, but there were no farms left. I mean, there was just no farms. They'd all been converted to suburbia mostly. And so they had to figure out how to have an agricultural land trust form to buy some land that could be set aside for the community for a farm. And so in other words, they had to go back to the very beginning to figure out how to build the system to supply the food they wanted, which I thought was kind of amazing. Farmers markets are wonderful because they, of course, help to provide fresher foods than we have in supermarkets. And locally grown foods, generally being more nutritious and delicious, also get people more excited about cooking and eating more vegetables and fruits, with the result of better health, which is of crucial importance in this age of epidemic obesity, especially among our young people. Beyond farmers markets, more and more consumers are turning to community-supported agriculture, known as CSAs, which we heard that you can sign up to possibly win a share in this. People sign up with a farm and pay ahead of time and then receive a box, usually every month or every week through the growing season, of wonderful fresh foods. Again, in the 1990s, there were 60 CSAs in the United States. In the year 2000, there were 1,700. In 2007, again, the last ag census, there were over 12,500 CSAs, many of them having waiting lists of people wanting to join. And so right now, I'm guessing that there's got to be more. So it's a very interesting alternative thing that's happening. And of course, there's been a huge renaissance in school and community gardens. It's crucially important to teach young people about foods and farming, where foods come from and how they can be grown, how to cook and eat well. Not only is this an important investment in public health and future well-being, but it helps to address a key problem of figuring out who are going to be the farmers of the future, and helping to inspire that next generation of farmers. And finally, a lot of people have started vegetable gardens. Some students have asked me, what have I done through my research? How have I changed my eating? That's what I did. I started. Here's my garden, and I found it to be incredibly rewarding to really grow foods for the first time, leafy greens, salads, potatoes, vegetables, and to know the full story of what I was eating, from seed to plant to string bean to skillet to plate. And some of the most important things that I think farmers markets and CSAs, school gardens, and home gardens have done is less tangible. They've really helped to start crucial dialogues in communities all across America about our food systems. And as we begin to question and think about it and consider what purpose the food system serves, I think many people have begun to realize it doesn't have to be the way it is. The way the food system evolved was to serve the needs of growing cities, to help create cheap foods and to make profits for food companies. But we can expect our food system to do more and have more benefits for our families and our health and our communities. And when I think we realize that, people start getting all sorts of creative ideas about how they might do things differently. And that's the kind of thing that's really happening in communities all across the country. So since the beginning of human time, food has really been a crucial way that we've known about and been linked biologically and culturally to the natural world. But as our culture urbanized and modernized, the stories and contexts of our food changed. And much of that knowledge and awareness ceased to be known. So as this armchair tour through history has shown, over the course of the 20th century, as consumers, we became supremely skilled at ferreting out bargains in the shopping cart and shopping by brand names and such. And that the idea of the bargain has become an almost universal value of our culture. But here, at the outset of the 21st century, we need to re-examine some of the hidden costs of our food system and learn how to bargain in new ways that will help create a more healthy environment and healthy food system for everyone. Today, with new interests, new understanding, new stories, new ideas, there's great hope. We have a chance to rediscover some old knowledge, to invent some new knowledge, and really to learn a new kind of kitchen literacy. And with it, we just might find a way to live better on Earth and finally to eat well. So thank you very much. So, yeah, I've been told we have time for just a few questions. So I know you probably have, that's been a lot to digest, this big tour, but does anybody have any questions or comments or things that came to them through this experience? Yes.
Yeah, we were talking about the kitchen counter
Yeah.
revolution. Like at Woodstock, all those kids crashed the gates and it turned into a huge concert. And then it rained and, it got kind of miserable. People didn't get a good night's sleep. The next morning, this guy named Wavy Gravy and the Diggers, they used to feed people in California.
Yeah.
They had like one of those psychedelic buses with brown rice and lentils. They got on the stage, took the microphone and said, "What we have in mind is breakfast in bed for 50,000.
And did they pull it off? Isn't that amazing? It's an interesting story. Were you there? Okay, cool. Straight from the horse's mouth. Yes.
Do you know what percentage of what we pay for food is for transportation?
I don't know the percentage of that. That's a really interesting question. I don't know. Does anybody else know that through studies of food? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting question.
The density of the food and everything.
You're right, and different kinds of foods.
Well, lettuce is got much higher because you don't pay too much for lettuce than
Weight-wise.
steak, carrots, or any of the harder things.
Right, and perishability would factor in, but there must be some average numbers. And, I actually have seen things that talk about like the carbon footprint of food transportation. And it turns out that the transportation is not as much as like you'd think as storing the foods and refrigeration and all. So, people have studied this, and of course it's incredibly complicated. But it's an important question that we've not really asked enough. We've kind of built the system, and now that the price of gas goes up, we need to ask that question a little bit more. Yes?
What's your take on genetically modified food?
Well, one of the things, it's a really complex topic, and one, of course, that's in the news a lot. And I think it would be really great if we could know if there are GMOs in our foods. We don't know right now. One of the things that I think is important to understand about that technology is that every genetically modified food is a different question. Now we talk about it all as one thing, but it's a very different matter if you're splicing a gene into a crop that is putting a pesticide in the crop, essentially, or if you're changing a gene to add nutrition, or you're changing a gene to make something grow faster. I mean, each one of those things has different impacts potentially on public health and on the environment. And the system we have for regulatory oversight right now is really based on one food, which was a tomato developed in the late 80s in a context that was in a political administration that was very anti-regulatory, in its orientation. So it's completely insufficient. There's also all sorts of problems with the economics of it, because that technology is consolidated in very powerful industries only. And so the way it's being promoted and dispersed potentially just is problematic to the idea that growing food should be something that everybody can do, that seeds should be able to be saved and used again. So there's a lot of ideological, or I don't know if it's ideological, there's just a lot of problems with it, the way it's being promoted right now. That said, I think I personally recognize that it's not necessarily a totally evil technology or something. I think that there could possibly be reasons or possibilities that it could be a useful technology for us in the future, but it certainly needs way more oversight, and we need to think through some of these social and economic problems of how it's being promoted way too fast right now. Yes?
Thank you for speaking to the very complicated subject of GMOs. I enjoyed reading your book. I'm not quite done with it yet.
Mm-hmm.
My husband and I own a conventional vegetable farm in Queen Anne's County, and I participate in the local farmers market.
Great.
I love your book. I feel like I'm on both sides of the coin because we're conventional growers. We have to make a living. But I can't ever answer that question on a Saturday morning with a long line of people in front of me for corn. Is this a GMO? Is your produce GMO, et cetera? I just appreciate your work and the history. I find it enjoyable, and I love raising my own vegetables, even my own herb garden that I cook with has nothing to do with our farm
Mm-hmm.
or my flowers or anything. But I
Yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much. And I would just also say, I talk a lot about organic agriculture in this slideshow in my book. But one of the things that I talk about also is how important local agriculture is too, and that it's all a spectrum. And in some places, organic agriculture isn't as possible as it is in other places, but there are other methods that people can use to minimize the pollutions that come from pesticides and herbicides. And it's important that we start having that dialogue and recognize that we all need to kind of move in that direction, but that not everybody can do that right away, and that there's tremendous value to keeping our local and supporting our local farms. So I'm so glad that you're able to still do that.
Yes, and recognizing that many local farmers comply with nutrient management practices now and are concerned about the environment and
Yeah.
use pesticides as possible. There's that stuff as well. So
Yeah, great, cool. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, Sarah.
Yes, I was wondering if you, in your research, if you found that there was a physical, chemical, or hormonal difference between meat that had been transported long distances and animals that had been transported long distances in the meat and which had been grown locally.
I did not find that, but I think that it's sort of different, I think, with different kinds of meat, but I think most animals are not transported long distances to butchering, although I guess beef, from what I understand, there's only like 4 beef packing plants in America, if you can believe that, so I guess there is that long transit. I have not found the answer to the question. It's a pretty interesting question, especially given what I was talking about in the 19th century of how transport was really a big problem. And of course, when you see animals being transported on the highway, it certainly looks like a stressful, awful circumstance. So it's a really good question.
I think you might have helped me find my thesis topic.
Okay. Interesting. I think it is really one of the things I found very rewarding about my research is the way that when you study history, it sometimes gives you this oblique look at what is happening in society today. And sometimes it's hard to understand what's happening around us now, and there are, issues of ideology or politics or things that make it difficult to figure out, well, what's really the truth? But then you go back through time and you see, well, there's another circumstance that's similar, and how did that play out? And sometimes I think being able to see our own time through different times is just a really valuable thing and that I really appreciate in history. So anyway, yes.
You touched on gathering, but did you come up through your research about fishing or hunting?
About fishing and hunting. I did not do a lot on that in my book, even though I was really interested in that personally to begin with. It just ended up being something that I couldn't include. One of the things that I did write about that was fascinating to me and that I'm continuing research on is the way that wild foods used to play a much bigger role in our diets, that people used to do a lot more foraging and gathering of foods like shellfish and fishing, and people of different socioeconomic groups had access to more foods that were wild foods that you might say are free foods, and how that changed through time, and how in fact our conservation ethic, because of course as the population grew and grew, we really had the capacity to eat everything. So we kind of as a society decided, well, we don't want to eat all the fish, we don't want to eat all the birds, and so different values started to come in, and those are important to realize in this whole question too. I mean, it would be wonderful if we could all eat wild fish all the time, but there are too many of us probably to really do that. So it's interesting ethical questions. Yes?
It seems like there's like 2 parallel tracks with food now that kind of have to do with economics, like the Whole Foods is known as whole paycheck because it's so expensive. And I just read actually today that they just allowed chickens to be sent to China to be processed and then returned back to the United States as nuggets or whatever.
Because it's cheaper to process.
Do it like that. So,
Yeah.
so many people in our society is going to go for the cheap stuff
Right.
how can we integrate the organic and the local and all that stuff in a way that would, I mean, what are your thoughts on how you could blend the two together to make it more accessible?
Yeah, it's a really important question and a really hard problem because the whole economy is really set up. The whole structure of wages and everything is set up based on the cheap food model. I mean, everything is set up on that model. And yet, of course, we're seeing now that there are huge public health costs related to this, and so that, people who are poor, who are eating bad foods, are more likely to have poor health as a result. And I mean, it's just tremendous injustice and inequity, and it's an awful thing. So how do we move forward? The movement towards local food and organic food is often criticized as being elitist. And yet, I think it's just an important start. And a lot of people who are food activists recognize these problems and, as I've seen, are really trying to work in those directions by doing things like figuring out how to host farmers markets in neighborhoods where there are not even supermarkets or where there is not access to fresh food. Programs in inner cities that are trying to teach people to garden and such. School garden programs in those kind of places. And also food banks kind of in places all around America, figuring out how to integrate with community gardens where people are growing food because they want to eat more healthily. How can we grow extra to share with people who might not have the time or the resources to do it on their own? So I think people are grappling with that question, and I don't really have an answer for you except to say that I think this is all an iterative process, and the only way to get us all to move in that direction is for some of us to just start moving in that direction. And hopefully, eventually, we will make some difference. And it may be that other food system will always be there and always be the dominant food system, and yet hopefully there will be options and opportunities that will become more prevalent. So, anyway.
Great hopeful note.
Yes. Okay.
The conversation, but we do have one more part of the evening, so
Yep.
before I turn it over to Bill Schindler, I just want to present you with a reminder.
Oh, my
of the
goodness.
evening here.
Wow.
We're very glad to have you with us. And
Beautiful.
thank you very much.
Thank you very